Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming along to this panel on housing. My name's Keelan Barr, and I'm the editor of the data projects team at The Guardian in London. And just before we get started today, we're going to have a poll of 2 questions to begin the panel, as we really want to get the sense of what the audience opinions and feelings are around housing as well. So there'll be questions that are coming up on the screen in the next minute or 2. And to participate and respond to the questions and give your feedback and your comments on the discussion that we're having on stage, you can participate by going to the Bcast part of the web app or the Bcast website. And when you go to the Bcast website, you go / at the end to OECD4. So all of the details are on the screen at the moment. So we have 2 questions for the poll, which will be on the screen shortly. And they really get to the heart of what when we had a brief discussion beforehand about the issue of housing and affordable housing, we felt that these were questions that really got to the heart of the discussion that we wanted to have today. And the first question that we have is about affordable housing. Now, affordable housing is not clearly defined in a number of OECD countries, and we wanted to get the opinion of the audience as to whether this matters. Do we need a definition of affordable housing? Is it easy to define? Is it something that should be simple? Is it something that should be applied more broadly across all of the OECD member states? Or is it something that is really not one size fits all? So we'd like to hear your opinion on that. And feel free as well to give comments as we go throughout the session. So we can continue to take some responses on that as we go. So most people are seeing of the participants are saying that affordable housing does matter, the definition does matter. Seems to be the way we're swaying at the moment. So we'll come back to this as well throughout the discussion. And we do have one more question as well, which is in relation to the provision of affordable housing. So one of the things that we're seeing quite a lot is the sale of social housing and then the expected replacement of it. And we wanted to check if people in the room felt that if affordable housing and the provision of new affordable housing, should it be provided by the public or the private sector? Is it the job of governments to provide affordable housing for society, or is it something that can be dealt with by the private sector? Or perhaps it's a mix of the two. So do let us know in your comments as well. Okay, so we'll see what the responses to the questions are as we go. So just as we do that, as people are responding, I'm going to just begin by introducing our panel. So I'll start from the very end. At the end, I have Juha Kannikin from Finland. And he is the CEO of Y Generation, which is providing social housing and affordable housing in Finland, one of the biggest providers. Next to him, we have Freke Spinnersen, and he is a member of Fentansa, which is one of the largest groups, NGOs, working on homelessness in countries throughout Europe. So he'll have many interesting insights for us as well. Beside him, I have Martin Rappos, and he is the CEO or founder of Civicor and augmented reality, and he's going to give us some insights as well into provision of affordable housing and the marketplace. Beside him, I have Kirsty Archer from the United Kingdom, who's a member of the London Renters Union, and Kirsty's going to give us some insights as to her experience of being a private renter in the UK and working with the Renters Union. And finally, last but not least, I have Anna Minton, who is a reader in architecture at the University of East London and author of Big Capital. And Today, with the panel and myself, we'll have a discussion about housing, about the provision of housing, the provision of affordable housing, homelessness, and social housing, and access to the market. So we are really very interested to hear your take on what we're talking about as well. So we'll have a discussion for about 45 minutes. Towards the end, we'll come back for questions from the audience. So do feel free to give us any of your comments as the conversation progresses, and towards the end, we will come back to get your feedback as well. Okay, so to begin, access to good quality housing and affordable housing is fundamental to people's well-being. And for many, this is a distant reality, and a growing distant reality. So it's projected that 1.6 billion people, so that's 1/3 of urban dwellers, will struggle to secure decent housing by 2025. That's not that long away. That's only 5 years to go, 5-6 years away. So as a background to that, global capital has an influence. So global capital has an influence on our housing stock, which is really the influence as to the discussion that we're having here today, my home, your investment. And so the concept that housing is bought for investment and the flow of foreign capital is having an impact on the market is impacting the middle classes, but also then exacerbating homelessness and impacting young people's access to the market and their ability to own a home. So homelessness is particularly on the rise in the past decade since the global financial crisis, though we do have countries like Finland, which have had some solutions or some approaches to minimizing homelessness or providing greater access to affordable housing. We've also seen other countries, such as New Zealand, try to take action through legislating to stem the flow of foreign capital into their market for non-residents. So governments around the world are taking action in one way or another, though today we do want to talk about what the situation looks like in the individual countries that we're from, and to get a sense on, is there commonalities? Is there something that we can do that we should be talking about more broadly across OECD countries? And what can we do as individuals also? So to begin, I'd like to just open a question to the panel, just to kind of get a sense of where we're at this year. We had a conversation on social housing, on affordable housing in this very room last year. And I just wanted to get a sense of what is the reality. Last year, at the end of our conversation, we kind of all came to similar conclusions, that it was a growing problem and that it was quite urgent. I wanted to get a sense from Frigg to begin with, as to what kind of reality are we dealing with when we talk about access to affordable housing as it currently stands?
That's a big question. Let me focus on what I know best, which is homelessness. We're, of course, very concerned about the financialization of the housing market, which is not a recent trend, but which becomes worse and worse. But on homelessness, I can confirm what you said. It's increasing in all EU member states. We work as an organization only in the European Union member states, so I can only say something sensible about that area of the world, except in Finland, where over the last more than a decade, homelessness has consistently been reduced. And from an outside perspective, you could probably say that in Finland, homelessness has reached the level of functional zero, probably very close to a solution to homelessness. But in all the other countries, it goes up, and in quite a number of countries, it goes up very rapidly. Like double-digit increases in a couple of years is not uncommon in a number of countries. And if you want, because you're probably going to ask me the question anyway, how many people experience homelessness in the European Union? It's very difficult to make an estimation, but because the demand is so high, we did an attempt to make an estimation. We believe that there is at least 700,000 people that are sleeping rough or in emergency shelter any given day of the year. And that's 70% more than when we last did that calculation 10 years ago. So it's a 70% increase in rough sleeping and people staying in emergency shelter, which is a massive increase. If you compare that to the trends in relative poverty, for instance, where there have been increases as well, it's uncomparable. There is something happening at the bottom end of society which is really, really concerning. And maybe just to add, it's not only in countries that have weak social welfare systems, also in countries which are known for their robust welfare systems, it's increasing. Netherlands, we have seen a 75% increase. Denmark has seen a massive increase in youth homelessness, etc. These are countries that we know for their social protection systems, and still they seem unable to stem the tide of homelessness.
You say something is happening at the bottom of the market. Might I ask you just to elaborate on what you think that something might be?
I think there's many factors that play a role, but the cost of housing or the affordability crisis is certainly an issue. When I started working in Fianza almost 20 years ago, it was difficult to argue that the simple question of affordability would lead to homelessness. Now it's quite common for people to become homeless because the housing is too expensive. Increases in family homelessness, for instance, points to that. It's because people can just not afford what is available on the market. But I don't want to simplify things. There's a number of factors that come at play. But what I can say, part of the thing that's happening at the bottom end of, of society is that housing becomes totally out of reach for the most vulnerable in society.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for setting the scene for us. From your perspective. Martin Rappos from Spijker, could you give us a bit of background as to your take on the housing crisis as it stands and the work that you do?
Yes, thank you very much. So we have established a platform for engagement of people in what is going to be built around us, and that is mainly because we want to help and we want to increase the understanding of you know what is happening. And so there is this big urbanization trend, which is also correlated with the increase of homelessness, obviously. And then there's this increased demand for affordable housing. So we work in a number of countries. We are mainly in the United States. We also work in the Netherlands, and we are also from Slovakia. So it's across the board. But in the Netherlands specifically, we work with an organization called the Stroomversnelling, which is also a speaker that was supposed to be here today, but he couldn't make it, so I'm replacing him. And we are helping him to visualize through augmented reality how social housing can be turned into net zero energy. And I think that is really an important aspect, because these are some difficult decisions that need to be made. And if you are able to persuade certain amount of people, you can actually get them on board, then you can create great projects. And net zero energy means, 40-year business case for a total renovation of a house, which is a difficult decision to make if you're the owner. But if you're renting, that can be, and if you're renting a social home, it can be quite interesting. So yeah, that's us, Spijker, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. And to my immediate left, we've got Anna. Anna, you recently wrote a book called Big Capital. Could you give us a sense of some of your findings through the book and the situation in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, sure. So my book is called Big Capital, Who is London For? And it does focus on London, but it focuses on London in the context of the UK and in the context of the broader trends affecting Europe and North America, where property, land and property, has become the main means from which we raise income today, rather than wages or growth. It's through land and property. And the housing crisis in the UK really is in a particularly acute phase. I mean, I've been writing about housing for a long time, and there's been a housing crisis in the UK for the last 25 years, all the time I've been writing about it. But from 2010, it just entered this really particularly acute period, and it's for a number of factors, three main factors. One is the influx of the big capital I talk about in the book, which is equally affecting many other cities around the world, where, well, in London, it's a mix of super rich money, oligarch capital, corrupt money in some cases. London is the billionaire capital of the world, but similarly other North American cities attract the same type of influx of money. That's combined with an enormous foreign investment market where we're building very large numbers of luxury apartments which are sold directly to Asian markets rather than hitting the London market. They're very high-priced properties. They're completely out of reach for most people who live in London. So that's the first factor, the influx of foreign capital into national markets. The second, that's been augmented by quantitative easing, which was the policy of creating money post-financial crisis to bail out the banks. And that money went disproportionately into the pockets of the richest and disproportionately into the most expensive parts of London for property. So that also pushed up prices. And that's had a trickle-down effect all across the city, raising house price inflation and rents, which means that that unaffordability crisis spreads, and increasingly people can't afford to live in central London, certainly not even outer London. And a lot of families, my contemporaries, are actually moving to South Coast towns, and I'm sure these are stories you're well aware of. Combined with that are two other major factors. One, long-term, in the UK, we have seen this huge transfer of housing from the public sector to the private sector through the sell-off of 2 million council homes over the last 30 years. And really that's a very, very big reason why we've seen this massive shortage of housing, which feeds directly into homelessness. And then the third factor, creating this squeeze, this pincer movement, is austerity, which has been a very big part of the policy landscape in Britain. Cuts to housing benefit, cuts to welfare policies, which means now that social housing tenants, a lot of whom now rent privately because there isn't that social housing anymore, they no longer get the amount of housing benefit they need to pay their rent. So they're constantly in this cycle of eviction and displacement. So those are the main factors, really. All the big capital is coming into a city like London. It's raising land and property prices. At the same time, you've got far less social housing and you've got austerity.
You describe a perfect storm, essentially.
Basically, that's right, yeah.
Right. All within a couple of decades, happening simultaneously. Kirsty Archer, could you give us a sense of your experience, just for the audience who might not be familiar with your background and your experience as a private renter in London and the work of the Renters Union?
Thanks. Hi everyone. So I rent currently in London, and actually on Sunday I was evicted from where we were living, and we had to move out into a new flat. So I guess I sort of represent Generation Rent. And yeah, we've found how basically insecure renting is in London. We were living in a flat for about 6 months, and then after we sort of reported to the landlord like serious things wrong with the property, like when we didn't have hot water and things like that, about a month later we got an eviction notice, and it's called Section 21 in the UK. And yeah, it was absolutely devastating. You sort of realise, even though you may feel happy in a property and comfortable, you're really not that secure, even though most of your earnings are going each month to this place that you're living. It's sort of like a double whammy where you've got so much of your money going to this property, and then even then you're not even secure in that. And it's also costed us so much to move out into where we're living now, which obviously I haven't really lived in yet because we literally moved in on Sunday. But yeah, so it's just a really precarious situation for people like me in London, that are, working people. I'm on a sort of average salary, I would say, and yeah, we just, unfortunately in the UK, I think it's got some of the worst renter protections. So we really don't have many rights as renters. We're actually currently, we tried to fight our eviction, and as a result of that, the landlord is basically trying to get us to pay court fees. So we're actually going to have to like go into debt and like pay the court because we tried to fight our eviction now. So yeah, it's a really like hard situation. And obviously I'm just one story, but there's thousands of people every day that are evicted in the UK. And as Anna alluded to, a lot of these people are very vulnerable. You know, people that have mental health problems, people that maybe like on the housing benefit and things like that, that are just kicked out. And like, no wonder we've seen such an increase in homelessness. And Section 21 is actually the leading cause of homelessness, according to the housing charity Shelter in the UK. But recently we had a government announcement that this law, Section 21, is being scrapped. However, it's sort of at a consultation phase at the moment, and I'm not sure whether like addressing it with one single policy is really going to cut it, because essentially landlords in the UK can still get away with raising rents to evict people, like to push people out by putting the rent up so much that they can't afford it. So I really think this needs like a lot of policies if we really want to address the housing crisis and make things more secure for people.
Okay, thank you very much. You raised some very interesting points around issues of kind of renter security, rent control, which some countries do have better standards on than the UK. Could you tell us a little bit more about what Section 21 actually is?
Yeah, sure. So Section 21 is the British law that describes no-fault evictions. So it enables landlords to evict perfectly good tenants that are paying their rent on time every month, just for no reason at all, basically. And I guess it gives it, landlords would argue, oh, if they want their property back, they can evict tenants easily. They only have to give 2 months' notice. So we were given 2 months to leave. So yeah, it's sort of like that was kind of the worst thing about when it happened to us, because we've done absolutely nothing wrong, and now we're in a situation where we've had to move out of somewhere which we really liked, and now we're going to be in debt because of it. So yeah.
And is your sense then that better regulation is the kind of, would be the solution for your particular situation, or is it something more broad? You mentioned that you think that...
Yeah, I definitely think it needs to be more broad. I think one of the things I just mentioned about court fees, so that was another sort of part of the system that we came across, which is cuts to legal aid. So because in the UK there's been so much austerity, as you said, so it's really hard to actually, even when you are evicted, if you want to fight that, if you can't afford to pay the court, then you can't fight it, so you can't get justice if you can't afford it. So I think we really need to see sort of a rollback of austerity in general in the UK, in addition to more secure rights for renters, and also, like I said earlier, rent controls, and just, yeah, so we can be in a position where it's not just that rent is controlled, but we're actually paying less rent, because essentially we're paying too much at the moment. Our wages aren't going up, it's unaffordable, it's unsustainable. So we don't just need rent controls, we need to be paying less rent every month.
And this is something that we will come back to as well in the discussion of affordable housing. Are we talking really about affordable housing in terms of ownership, or even affordable housing in terms of rent, access to the rental market too? Juha, at the end of our panel, I'd like to just ask you about your work in Finland and what's happened in Finland in the past decades to help reduce homelessness.
Well, I think that first of all, affordable housing, when you compare situation in different countries, you can see a strong correlation between the supply of affordable housing and actual visible street homelessness. And in Finland, the last 10 years, we have been implementing our national policy, which is based on housing first principle, which means that we provide homeless persons permanent housing with support if that's needed. And this really has changed the structure of homelessness services in Finland, because we have been replacing the temporary accommodation in shelters and hostels with other permanent housing solutions. Normally, it means independent rental apartment with your own rental contract. And I think that in this process, the amount of affordable social housing has played a crucial role. Finland is not a paradise of affordable social housing, but we have been able to keep it on a decent level during the years. And implementing housing first is not possible unless you have housing first. You need to have that housing available. And what's important in Finland is that in each new housing area, we always have at least 20% affordable social housing. So it keeps it on a decent level. It could be bigger, and now we have negotiations for the new government, and we are very much pressing that this percentage should be at least 30%. But even 20% is better than nothing. And I think that these are very much related. I think that affordable housing has, the concept of affordable housing has meaning only in relation when the alternative is no housing. So for that reason, you can't end homelessness without having affordable social housing. And it has also a preventive role, the supply of affordable social housing. There's a very recent Australian study which showed that affordable public housing can be a very strong protective factor against homelessness. And I think that based on our experiences, that's really true.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a very varied panel. We're interested to look at some of the comments that are coming back in relation to our questions. The first question that we posed was, should affordable housing, or do we need a definition for affordable housing, as many countries lack such a definition? Just want to put that question to the panel as well. Is there a sense from anybody that the definition is not important and that the market can decide? I'm intrigued. Or otherwise, perhaps I should say then, because yes.
Can I first react on the tenancy protection in the UK? One of the advantages to stay in the European Union is that you're constantly confronted with comparison with other countries. And when you say that there is countries that do better than the UK, the 6-month secure tenancy as a standard tenancy is a nonsense from a European perspective. Like, I don't know any country that has that. I'm talking about the European Union. I don't know any country that has that kind of standard tenancy so short. Like, if I'm not mistaken, the standard tenancy in Germany is life. In my country, in Belgium, it's 9 years. Like, it's absolutely a nonsense. Not like in a European comparative framework that should change. Like, that cannot be difficult to argue for. Now, on the definition. Of course, the definition is important, but I think we should not assume there is no definition available. There is a definition. There is a definition of unaffordable housing, at least in the European Union. It's what we call people in housing cost overburden. And that's a commonly used definition. Eurostat collects data on that every year for all EU member states. And housing cost overburden means households that pay more than 40% of their income on housing. And if you want to know what are the figures that Eurostat gathers, of course it's all averages, etc., and there's limitations about the data, I understand that. But it's 10% of the whole population in the European Union that lives in housing cost overburden. If you look at poor people, it's 40%. 40% of poor people live in housing cost overburden. And it can get to very extreme situations. In Denmark, 75% of the poor population pays more than 40% of their income on housing. And in Greece, it's almost the entire population in poverty. It's close to 90%. So if you look at the definition that is used of unaffordable housing, it hits the whole population. Or a large part of the population, but it hits especially the poor, and we shouldn't forget that. Like, I sometimes get a little bit worried about the focus on the middle class. I understand that in the run-up to elections, that's an interesting focus to have because it's a large part of your electorate. And I also don't want to deny the reality of struggling people in the middle class. But if you take the income quintiles of the population and you look at how many of them are in housing cost overburden, for the first, the lowest income quintile, it's 1/3 of the population. For the second, it's 1/10. For the third, it's 1/20. For the fourth, it's 1/50. And for the highest income quintile, it's 100. So I think we have to make sure that in our focus on the middle class, especially newcomers on the housing market, etc., that's issues. It's important issues that we don't overlook the people that are already struggling on the housing market, and that we don't overlook the people living in poverty. And then I'm not even talking about homeless people, which are out of the statistics. They're not even captured by Eurostat. And I already mentioned to you it concerns 700,000 people on any given day. But if you look over the time span of a year, you're probably around a figure around 3 million people that experience homelessness over the period of a year, short-term or long-term homelessness. So the definition exists. It's an important definition. There is pressure, actually, maybe I have to finish with that. There is pressure at the moment to change that definition of housing cost overburden. There is currently a European Citizens Initiative that has been submitted, which asks the housing cost burden definition to be changed to a limit of 25%. And I'm not sure if that's a smart thing to do, because you will have very, very large parts of the population that are in that situation, and I don't know if that helps to target limited resources, but that's maybe my biased perspective.
Anna, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting what you've been saying, and I mean, every European country, well, I mean, every OECD country, every country is going to have different ways of looking at affordability. And what's interesting is that you've been looking at affordability in terms of percentage of costs spent on housing, and percentage of income spent on housing. The way the UK looks at affordability, the way that London in particular looks at affordability, is in terms of percentage of market value, which just shows how actually financialised our system is compared to the European perspective. So what happened in London in 2010, I do struggle a little whether this was the Mayor of London or whether this was a UK-wide definition. I think actually it's a UK-wide definition. When the Conservative-led coalition came into power in 2010, they changed the definition of affordable housing to mean up to 80% of market rent or market value. So there are thresholds which state that in new developments, 25% of housing has to be affordable, but when that 25% is at 80% of market value, where the average two-bedroom property in central London will be upwards of £750,000, that's not actually remotely affordable. So that's why we've come to this situation that we're in the UK. And I think certainly that in some parts of North America, the situation might be similar, definitions might be similar. So all our definitions of affordability are actually market-led affordability, and we call what's so-called starter homes, where people are enabled to buy homes through various subsidies. We call that affordable housing too. So these are all market-led definitions rather than definitions which rest on costs and income. So I think that's another complexity to add into that definition discussion. But just, I mean, I think what we should be looking at is, you know, what is social housing? We used to call it council housing, you know, so for example in Vienna, where I believe they have, you know, around 50% of housing is actually social housing. That is at a much reduced rent level to market rent.
I think that it should be important to discuss about what makes housing affordable. What are the elements of affordability? And in a small country like Finland, for example, if you think about construction costs, it's a very small market for construction business. That's not really something that you can do much. So it seems that there always needs to be some element of public support or subsidy. And in Finland, it's in the form of the land cost, because you can build affordable social housing only on public land, the value which is 20% lower than the market price of the land. That's, of course, one element of affordability. And then, of course, if you are a non-profit provider, there's elements which make it the rent cost lower. But I think that there's also one way that countries are using to make housing affordable, and it's the housing benefit. But I think that it's only a short-term solution when you don't have enough affordable social housing, because it's more a sustainable solution to affordability to have that kind of housing stock.
I think the definitions are kind of dangerous, right? Because so what happens if, for instance, there's a lot of population which is under 39%, right, where it's becoming a burden. And as you said, it changes from country to country, and the metrics, if metrics is so different that, for instance, you have percentage of income versus market value, that makes the definition pretty useless, right? I mean, I think society should pretty much strive, like in Finland, what I sense is, strive to just get to effective zero of homelessness, therefore providing enough homes of any sort to actually solve the problem, right? I mean, you don't, because it's the definition. If you go by definition, then you change it. For instance, the conservative government, as you mentioned, right? You have a problem. You change the rules of the game, and then you can ease or, do whatever you please to actually, get where you want to be with your finances, with your budget. Whereas if you find an actual business case, and with some sort of regulation, I think you are able to just get naturally to that effective zero of homelessness. For instance, when we discussed with Juha how are his projects financed, a large portion of that in Finland is by government aided mortgages, right? And that helps obviously to create a net zero business case.
One of the retorts that we commonly hear when we talk about affordable housing and the shortage of housing, or the shortage of affordable housing, is that it's simply a matter of building more houses, simply a matter of building more. I'd like to just put that to the panel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's building more houses is certainly part of the equation, but it's what kind of houses. So if you look around the London skyline or the Dublin skyline, or actually other European capitals, other British cities, you will see so much construction going on, but it is all of this luxury apartment building. And this idea that supply will satisfy demand is simply not the case when you're building that kind of housing, which is why I think it comes back to the question of what sort of housing should we be building. And, actually, if we want to solve affordability problems in countries which do have this speculative property-driven economy where house price inflation is so enormously high, we have to build housing in a very different way. And, we have to build housing on public land, as you say, and I would say we have to build what we call social housing, and, other European countries probably call various different things.
So we have an example from Slovakia, where I'm originally from, and I discussed this with the mayor of Bratislava, the capital city. The demand for social housing or rental homes, social rental homes, owned and built on public land is tremendous. So we have around 10,000 families or people that need that kind of home, but there are only 200, 300 units that are being built. It's a good start, but for 10 years there's been nothing, right? So and we are mostly focusing on refurbishing of homes. Now, the issues that we are facing is acceptance. So there's a lot of not in my backyard initiatives against building social housing, which is a problem of a society, right? So there needs to be a step taken before. Different countries differ, obviously, but there needs to be a step taken into participation and inclusion of communities where you actually need to make peace with actually having a social housing right next to your home, which potentially may have impact on your resale value of your homes, right? So that needs to be taken into account as a part of a wider picture. I wonder how it's taken care of in Finland, because I feel that, or in the Netherlands as well, for instance, you have quotas for sustainable homes, for social homes and new developments. Is that 25% you mentioned?
It's currently 20% in the new housing areas, and it also creates a ready social mix. And an important element is also that the quality of the housing, social housing, it's the same as in the private, or sometimes even better. So you can make the difference when you see the housing, which one is social housing and which one is not. But I think that it really is important what kind of housing is built, because I have not seen that kind of trickle-down effect on housing market, that building luxury apartments would give more room for people with low income. So I think that you should see social housing as a kind of infrastructure element of society.
I would just add that there are a lot of places, like homes in London, or properties I should say, that aren't currently being lived in. So in sort of response to that question about supply, in the UK, well, in London especially, there are a lot of properties that could be lived in, but are just at the moment used by a lot of the time foreign investors as assets to make money from. So they're just sat there, bricks and mortar that people could be living in, but instead, because of the way the UK is set up, they're just seen as an instrument to extract wealth from for the already super rich. So it's not so much of a, like, there's not enough supply. There is homes there that could be lived in, but unfortunately, because our political system is so sort of in favour of capital and money, we're not really seeing like those homes used for what they should be, which is shelter and places that people can actually live in.
Yes, we obviously agree that we need more social housing and quite rapidly as well, because like I said, homelessness is increasing fast. But just maybe a little caveat, because there is countries with a lot of social housing but still increasing homelessness. And so, like, take the example of the Netherlands, for instance. 30% of the total stock is social housing, and still homelessness has increased between 2009 and 2016 by 75%. Only 1/3 of the social housing companies in the Netherlands house homeless people. So there needs to be an element of allocation based on the urgency of the need. I totally understand the argument of social mix, and you need mixed communities, and you don't want to create ghettos in social housing, etc. But maybe there is a better balance to be found. Or I can give the example of Vienna. Vienna has impressive public housing policy, which has been built over the last 100 years, and more than half of the stock is public or affordable housing. But still in Vienna, and it's not a huge city, and it's a rich city, 11,000 people experience homelessness every year. 11,000. The government spends 75 million euro on shelter, on the homeless system. So I think yes, we need more social housing, public housing, for sure. But we probably also have to look a little bit into how the social housing is allocated and whether very vulnerable groups lose out in the allocation process. Again, without compromising the issues of social mix and other important factors.
Just would like to come back on one of the other questions that we asked the audience as well. So there seems to be kind of broad consensus that there needs to be more housing, that we need to have kind of consideration of what that mix of housing which we're building is, and then also in the allocation of the housing itself, there needs to be further considerations. Who should be building these new houses? Is it the role of public office? Is it the role of governments to ensure that there are safe and secure homes for society, or is it something that the private market should and can provide? And somebody did make a comment on one of the questions as well. Why not both?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to be a completely binary black and white answer, but I don't think social housing should be a financialised instrument. And I think at present it is. And actually in the UK, we have some American companies which are poised to enter our social housing market. And I think we have to completely move away from that. And we should look at social housing sitting outside a market value situation. And I always cite the example of Zurich, and there's going to be someone from Zurich in the room at some point when I do this, and they're going to say your example isn't quite right. But what I've heard is that in Zurich, the municipality has said that all public land has to go into joint ventures with housing associations for social housing. And in London, Transport for London has said that all its public land has to go into joint ventures with private developers to build the kind of luxury apartment-led schemes that we are seeing. So it just depends really on the political will behind the kind of outcome you want to see. So the Zurich example would be a partnership with a housing association, perhaps not so dissimilar to the housing companies you see in the Netherlands and, you know, in other Northern European countries. But it would be very different from the sort of private sector led type of partnerships that we see in the UK.
If I may respond to that, I do believe in the market force, and I do believe in the good old economy of scale, for instance. Right? So, to give you an example of what's happening in Slovakia right now, the vastly underserved demand that we have, they're trying to solve by buying a large number of apartments from the developers. Now, these are the kind of apartments that can be actually turned into affordable, that can be affordable. And by the economy of scale, they drive the price down, which then they offer at favorable terms, either for rent or for purchase. Right? So you can actually, it's just a small example of how market force can be used to actually, I'd say, augment the market.
I think Eva has something to contribute.
I think that in principle both can play a role, but in practice it's very difficult, at least in a small market like in Finland, to see what's the incentive for private companies to build affordable social housing. So normally it means that they should get as a compensation some good construction sites to make profit, and that's not a sustainable solution, I think. So it needs a strong involvement from the government or public bodies and NGOs, non-profit NGOs. But I think that Freek also raised up an important issue, that how social is the social housing actually, and that's a point of discussion also in Finland. I think we could solve homelessness completely by providing housing from social housing that become vacant during 1 year for the rest of the homeless people we have in Finland. But that's not actually happening.
Maybe also to say that the reality of housing exclusion and severe housing exclusion is in the private rental sector. So you can make a business case, but I don't know if it's an ethical business case. In my city, for instance, if you're an unscrupulous landlord, you can make fortunes investing in crap housing and renting it out to undocumented migrants or other vulnerable people. Like in Brussels, there's even people renting out mattresses at 8 hours a day, you know. Like, so there is obviously a business case to be made, but I think if you want to have proper investment into affordable housing that is high quality, I think you cannot do it without public authorities.
There is one interesting factor that you mentioned, Juha, which is the construction cost, right? So I believe if you look at the breakdown of the revenue of a developer, the construction cost is I mean only 30% of the 30 to 50% of the revenue, right? So the rest is sales and is profit. If you take away that and you're looking at construction costs purely, with a healthy 10% margin, which is higher than typical construction companies making, you can build a lot of affordable homes. Would you believe that?
Well, it's the price of land, isn't it? That's the big problem.
If you build on public land.
Well, of course, you can build more cheaply, but it only means that you can make more profit, because the market sets the price level. So it's not in market-led housing. It's not based on the actual construction costs.
Yeah, but if you could make it such.
Well, that's not going to happen without the involvement of the public authorities.
Okay. Just looking at some of the comments as well in relation to this question that we put out. We just have some comments from the audience. Somebody mentions that it doesn't matter what kind of houses are being built. If supply comes from the luxury end, people moving into these luxury flats will free other flats, triggering a moving chain, which in the end means greater availability at the lower end as well.
It's just not true. I mean, just come to London and see what's happened. I mean, as we've talked, you know, we've got so many luxury apartment schemes where you've got this buy-to-leave phenomenon, and prices have just gone up throughout the city. It's just not how it works. You know, demand is not satisfied by increasing this type of supply.
One of the other comments that we have, there's a question actually, is financing the culprit, or is it that housing is seen as the safest way for individuals to leverage large sums of capital?
Yeah, I think this is sort of the problem in general at the moment, is that housing is just seen as an asset. It's seen as a way to make money from investors, and actually we need to start rethinking like what is housing for essentially, and we need to start providing on that basis. So housing is for shelter, it's for security, it's a place for people to build home, to raise their families in. It's a social good, and I think the problem in the UK, which is obviously like an extreme example, is that we've gone too far in the other direction of seeing it as simply a way for investors and, you know, big capital to make money from. And like people like myself are obviously, you know, the people that are suffering as a result of that. So yeah, we need to change the vision of what we think housing is for.
Anna and I think you both want to have a comment, but let me just read one more comment as well, which I think relates to this. Somebody in the audience has said, what is the best way, questioning what's the best way to counter foreign investment that's impacting affordable housing? And they've given the examples of Chinese investment in New Zealand, where the government has taken action to stem the flow of foreign capital, non-residents into the market, and Saudi Arabian investment in Lebanon is another example that's been given.
Yeah, I agree, and I think tax on foreign investors is something that we should certainly look at in the UK, just to come back to the point of housing as an asset, which it is, you know, for the majority of people who are homeowners, it is. And I think we do have to be really careful to put this isn't a question of a sort of individual choice or a consumer choice, you know, within the sort of the systemic, within the housing structure that we've created in the UK, that is a sensible choice. You know, people are not doing things wrong by doing this if they're lucky enough to have got onto the housing market 20 years ago. What we have to do is we have to actually revise that system, change that system, you know, look at the whole sort of social contract around housing. But I think we have to be really careful to take it away from the individual level, because I don't think it's about people's individual choices at this point. It's actually on a far larger scale.
So, in my mind, if you look at the housing as an asset, it's part of a much larger asset class, which is really the built environment. Now, built environment is worth hundreds of trillions, and it's the highest value asset class on Earth. Now, this is how we have been building and reshaping the planet, and we almost destroyed it, and we are on a good way of doing that. And I just don't see how this is going to change anytime soon. Right? Maybe housing as a subclass, as a sub-asset class, we can put some regulation around, but the thinking is there. Right? I mean, we are building assets. We're building offices, hotels, distribution centers, roads, just to boost the economy. We're not going to start thinking of assets as a service, if you will. And especially, you know, those that are triggering the investments, they're not going to start thinking of asset as a service for the poor anytime soon. So I really don't know how we could change this or how we could do anything sensible about it.
Yeah, I guess I just want to come in there because as I was introduced, I'm from the London Renters Union, and I guess from my perspective, the answer is about building power from below. And so in London, because of the crisis with renting, last year a London Renters Union was set up so that people like me can basically come together and demand the change that we want to see and empower one another. And it's basically the reason that I'm here today is because I joined the London Renters Union. So I think it's an example of how we can build power from below. And I think that's the only way we're going to get policy change. It's the only way we're going to get, people in powerful positions to actually listen to us. It's by demanding that change on the ground and coming together like people that are renting and are in this situation in solidarity and supporting one another to demand that change. And obviously having a well-articulated vision of what we want to see and what policies we want to see. And I think that's sort of like the campaigning strategy that I would come at it from.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We're going to now open the floor to questions. We've got about 10 minutes or so with which to do so. We started slightly behind schedule, so we'll take 10 minutes. And if you do have a question, please just raise your hand and someone will come to you with a mic. And please do stand up when you ask the question as the session is being recorded. And introduce yourself, please.
Great. Thank you very much. Great panel. Adam from Canada. So I do affordable housing in Malawi. And when I look at the UK market for housing, and we talked about the major causes. So in Canada anyway, there's an immigration benefit to investing in real estate. Okay, and also as an asset class, there has to be a return on that investment. Otherwise, these luxury houses that stay vacant don't have any return. So what about completely eliminating the immigration benefits of investing in real estate and treating it as any other asset class that they have to get a return? So wouldn't that solve the problem and then cut out all the different speculators?
So the question relates to, I guess in Canada as well, there is a large issue in Vancouver in particular, right, with foreign capital and local markets. So the question relates to immigration benefits, as you mentioned, which I don't think is the case in the UK. There are investor visas, you know, you invest 5 million and you get a visa to the UK. But quite often, as I understand it in the UK at the moment, there is no particular benefit to buying a property in the UK other than that you have potential residents. And then, of course, the return, the expected return on the asset, right? So it's, Anna, do you want to?
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm not familiar with that terminology. I mean, all I can say is, in terms of introducing any sorts of regulatory policies or intervening to stop off-plan sales, which is how a lot of these properties are sold. They're sold off-plan before they've been built. In Asian markets, 5% is sold in the first year, 10% in the second, and only the balance on completion, which introduces structural instability in the market, but it's a market completely based on speculation and the hope that prices will just continue to rise. But in terms of eliminating that, I mean, it's a question of political outlook. I don't think the current administration would have any desire to eliminate that approach, and that's why we're talking about the themes we're talking about.
Any other thoughts?
Actually, just yesterday I happened to read about an article about real estate business in Vancouver, about criminal gangs doing money laundering, which is also a very sinister element of this business, and it's also raising the prices of the market.
Just to return to the audience, and there is one other comment as well, which is seeking more people on the panel and more people with a liberal economic perspective so that we could have a proper discussion and actual debate. So if someone would like to contribute in that regard, we'd be very happy to hear. Are there any other questions or thoughts from the audience?
Hello, good morning. My name is Suzanne. I'm from Sciences Po Paris. I wanted to ask the OECD's Code of Liberalization, as well as the European Commission's Directorate of Competition, can interpret social housing provision as financial protectionism. So I know we don't have any representatives from those institutions here today, but what is your specific view on that? Also because you mentioned the example of the city of Vienna, and the city of Vienna has actually been challenged in the past by the European Commission on this matter. Like they said, it could be interpreted as state aid and is funding too much for middle-class people to have access to social housing, because in the city of Vienna is actually very much targeted to middle-class people, and European Commission said it could distort the housing market.
Great, thank you.
It's a very complicated question. I actually was not aware that the Commission formally intervened on the Vienna case. That's new to me. I know that they formally intervened on the Dutch situation, expressing some concern about violation of state aid rules because of the size and the target of social housing. Like, it's up to them to answer. Like, what the law says is that housing should be provided for vulnerable groups and less disadvantaged groups, or something like that. And I think the European Commission has understood that it's not helpful to intervene too strongly in the provision of social housing, and they have a very wide interpretation of these concepts, is my understanding. But from our perspective, like the more social housing you have, the more ambitious you can be in terms of reaching out to a wider target group. So I understand that Vienna reaches out to middle class if they have so much public housing. So my view is that the European Commission should not interfere with that. But I'm still concerned about the fact that Vienna doesn't house its homeless people, for instance. So you have to see it from both ends. But it's a very complicated issue, and I'm only aware of two cases, one in the Netherlands and one in France, but I didn't know the Commission interfered in Vienna. But it's like you said, it can be unhelpful, and it can be an obstructive intervention. But our view is the more social housing, the better, and the more social housing, the more ambitious you can be in terms of your aims.
Any other thoughts?
I'd just like to address the point about a sort of more diverse panel and a larger range of views. And I have to say, I really, really couldn't agree more. And, you know, I often find myself on panels where there's a lot of agreement, and it's quite hard to get people from a more economically liberal perspective or big developers to actually participate in panels. So, you know, all I could say is I couldn't agree more, and I wish these debates really could be opened up as much as possible.
Interestingly, it is something that we did discuss in preparing the panel and made efforts to address as well, because this is something that was a concern for some of the panelists as well. So, are there any other questions from the audience? I do have one final point from some of the BCAST comments as well, which is gentrification. So somebody says, given the effect of gentrification and the impact that has on any housing policy, what's the opinion of the panel in this regard?
So in London, we're seeing lots of places gentrified, and it's leading to a situation where working class communities that have lived in places like East London for their whole lives are sort of being turfed out because, again, it comes back to social housing funding cuts and not being enough of that being provided. But then also big developers coming in and building luxury apartments, and they're kind of like pushing people out, like outpricing people. So like there's been a term coined called social cleansing. So people that they're having their sort of where they've grown up in, which are like social homes, being demolished and told that they can't move to another social home that's in the same area, and they're being moved to other parts of the UK, like north of England. So obviously that's like completely uprooting working class families that are from those areas just to make way for, you know, again, big business, big capital, so that they can sort of you know, do business in these sort of up and coming popular parts of London, and again that just sort of disadvantages the most vulnerable working class communities, and I think this is a big issue that needs to be addressed, and yeah, I guess that's something that housing policy again needs to take into account. So I think that's a really good point.
And we're just going to wrap up soon, so I'll just invite any last comments or thoughts from the panel in terms of the responses, some of the questions from the audience that we might not have got to address that are on the BCAS system in front of us, or comments on some of the questions and responses that we've had from the audience.
I mean, just on gentrification, I would say that what we're seeing in London and in other British cities and in some North American cities isn't gentrification, simply because of the speed of capital flows and the speed of changes. And while the themes might not be dissimilar, gentrification has generally been understood as a process which takes place over a generation or perhaps 30 or 40 years, where areas change much more organically. And this has been such a rapid change, so I wouldn't call it gentrification.
There is one thing I have in mind in relation to one of our projects in New York, which is interesting, because if, in terms of upgrading homes to move people out and get a higher income class people in, they're building modular homes, modular high-rises. A company is called Full Stack Modular, and they basically create a high-rise out of containers, if you will. It's not really containers. They create these constructions. Yeah, that's something very hard to turn into an upgraded home, which you can sell to richer people. So if you have a high-rise like that for 40 years, it's pretty sustainable towards, lower income can be really used as a social home. Julie?
I can see your eyebrows raising there.
Well, just to comment on this lack of liberal views, that we have that kind of discussion in Finland. There are liberal economists who claim that we should stop the support for building social housing. We should only give housing benefits so that each individual could choose where to live. I can understand the theoretical point of view, but I don't see that as a sustainable solution for affordable housing.
Can I ask why not?
Well, it really doesn't work in practice. At the moment, the housing benefit in Finland is 2 billion euros, the amount of housing benefits, and over half of it goes to private market. So it's quite easy to see that providing more affordable social housing, you can also lower these costs for the society of housing benefit.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm actually quite like that we're on a panel like this. I think, just to come back to that beyond not enough liberal commentators, like liberalism is literally the most dominant economic paradigm like we are living in like for decades, and I think it's really important that we have spaces where we can have people like us that actually have answers and solutions to the problems on the ground to discuss that, especially in places like OECD, which is very much sort of promoted market liberal economy. So I think it's really important that we listen to, you know, other voices like ours that actually, you know, can sort of address these issues. And I think I'm really pleased that OECD have like invited me today to talk on this panel, so thank you.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and our audience for the interesting comments and debate, because we really are interested to know what your take is on our discussion as well. We've talked from the very kind of beginning, from access to housing and the increase in homelessness. We've talked about the need for more social housing. We seem to have quite a bit of consensus on that. And there was also a discussion that although there may be incentives to build more houses, and that would be a good thing, then it depends on the kind of properties that are being built as well, a point that Anna raised. And also about allocation, who actually gets the houses or who is given the houses or given access to them as well. I'd like to thank my panelists and the audience, and I would invite you to give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.
When I